21ª Cátedra Europa, el encuentro académico y cultural del Caribe colombiano y el mundo académico europeo. Europa se vive en el Caribe.
Thank you for inviting me to this inspiring conference here in Barranquilla. I was already once in Barranquilla 4 years ago, and for me it's a pleasure to come back. Well, looking at this letter, you can see that there is a long tradition of connections between Barranquilla, where this is posted, and Germany, although this letter is not to Hamburg, but it's to another city in Germany. But you can see it's a long way to get to Barranquilla from Hamburg to here. Well, I tell you very briefly what you can expect in my presentation, and maybe as somebody understands not that good English, we have a short Spanish summary at the end of my presentation. So I start with the origins of the port of Hamburg, the booming port until World War I, resurgence and the crisis in the interwar period, new problems and growth perspectives after World War II, and then challenges at the end of the 20th century and the future of the past. And afterwards we'll have another presentation which looks in the future of the port of Hamburg. That's not that what I will do. Well, when you have a look at this map, you can see Hamburg was always an amphibious city located north of the river Elbe, and you can see many islands here, and this situation was transformed over many periods and transformed again. You can see the beginning of the port here in this area, which is marked in blue. Later there was a ring of fortifications around the area. And of course, the port was always included into the ring of fortifications because the port was very important for the local economy. There were the expensive goods, and that was the reason why the port was always in all seaport cities included into the fortifications. So in the middle of the 19th century, there was a very, very important decision made, which is important until today, and that was the discussion of becoming a tidal seaport or becoming a dock port. And at that time, London was the most important port of the world, and London was a dock port where all ships had to pass through docks to get into the port, while other ports where there was a lower tide were tidal seaports. This was the situation, and this was one proposal. And you can see all the locks here. The ships had to pass through these locks to get into the port. Here another image, another plan, but the decision in Hamburg was for a tidal seaport, that all ships at any time could come into the port. And then the first artificial quay was built, the so-called Sandtor Kai, and at that time it was one of the most modern infrastructures in the world. You can see this line here of warehouses, and then this perspective where the ships could be unloaded very quickly. And here you can see again the medieval city. Well, there was a discussion in Germany with the federal government, with the Chancellor Bismarck, that Hamburg should become part of the German Empire. And for that reason, there was a discussion of becoming a free port or only becoming a free port district. And this decision was made. And you can see this Sandtor Kai again, but warehouses all around here. And the decision was that this area should become part of the free port here. And all the existing buildings here were demolished, and about 20,000 people had to be relocated that these warehouses could be built. And you can see the situation before the construction of the warehouse district and afterwards. So in a way, it was a city in the city, only for storing goods. there was no housing allowed, there were no cultural facilities and other things, only warehouses. And a bank, of course, a post office, yes, but otherwise only warehouses. And you can see how it was functioning. You can see that smaller boats came along here, then the goods were taken into the warehouses, then they were taken on trucks or on the railway, and on the other hand there were also temporary sheds, you can see here, for goods which were unloaded here and then transferred directly to other parts of Germany. So at that time it was the most modern structure of cargo handling in the world, I suggest. And well, you can see this warehouse, for example, was built in 1907, and these warehouses were very solid structures. You can here see it, and for cargo handling and for duty-free processing, for example, coffee from Colombia. I don't know if this coffee is from Colombia, but that's the reason why these warehouses still exist and why these expensive goods, also spices, tea and other things, were kept here. So meanwhile, the warehouse district, you can see it here on this image, became World Heritage. The decision was taken 3 years ago. And you can see it's a large area, 26 hectares, with 17 building complexes in this red brick traditional structure only for port and port-related uses, 300,000 square meters of storage area, and we can say it's the largest integrated complex of warehouses in the world. Here you can see it again, the city in the city, and not connected anymore with the city center, only warehouses, a power station, a bank, post office, yeah, but otherwise only warehouses. So this was the situation in the 1990s, in the 1890s, I'm sorry. And then in the beginning of the 20th century, the port of Hamburg was really booming and competing with the largest ports in the world, London and New York. And one topic, of course, or one important factor of the port was emigration. And Hamburg was very important for emigration, and you can see also an area was built up here with houses for the migrants, where they were checked for their health conditions, where they could have dinner, lunch, and so on and so on. And you can read maybe this year, this was by a famous man here in Hamburg who said, "My field is the world." So Hamburg is the basis, but we are operating all over the world with our business. And here are some more other pictures providing healthy conditions for the migrants who stayed in Hamburg for some weeks before they went on to the ships. So you can see here the increase of support. This was support in about 1800, and then all these new structures with these types of finger piers here, and of course dock labor in the port, which was in a way casual labor for hours or for days, by night, by day. It was dangerous. You can see it here, balances with coal, for example, and that was the situation, hard labor work before the World War I. But on the other hand, of course, also first by hand, then by steam, and then by electricity. So modern ways of handling the cargo, you can see it here, were developed and were taken into use. Then the dockers, of course, and the shipyard workers had to go to the docks and how to get there. So there were boats, and they rowed to the ships where they arrived, where the ship yards had been on the southern part of the river. And to get better connections between the northern part and the southern part of the river, a tunnel was built in 1910, which provided better connections from the housing districts of the laborers to the port area. Well, and of course, the port was increasing, more dockers, more shipyards were built, and you can see here some innovations in shipbuilding industries. Here again, modern ways and technologies were introduced, and this area here, south of the city center, this is the city center. Here the shipyards were located, and some of them are still located there. A big problem was always the housing conditions of the dockers, the shipyard workers, and of course, you can say some of them were more or less slums, and the merchants started to improve their housing conditions because they wanted healthy dock workers, of course. There was a big strike at the end of the 19th century, and some of the housing conditions were improved. So, World War I was, of course, a big break because Germany lost the Third World War, and afterwards there was a big crisis in shipbuilding and cargo handling and so on. But in the beginning of the 1920s, the port and the economy recovered, and you can see here some images, somebody looking at the big passenger ships here, or here the Imperator, one of the largest ships at that time in the world, or here you can see a ship built in Hamburg, which is higher than the high-rise buildings in New York. So these are important images to illustrate the economic power of the shipyards in Hamburg. And you can see the trade connections here, which were already more or less global, from Hamburg here, for example, to the Caribbean, but also to North America, to Africa, to Asia, China, and Australia. And you can see it was a dense network which was already developed in the 1920s. This map is from 1925. And again, shipyard became more important. They were booming in the 1920s. Large passenger vessels were built in Hamburg. The largest shipping companies were based. But in 1929, there was the economic crisis, and you can see here the growth in cargo handling until 1929, and then this big crisis here until the beginning of the 1930s. And you can see again the dock work, and in wintertime, of course, cargo handling here is especially dangerous for the dockers. Well, World Economic Crisis, 1929, the tugboats were not used anymore, were in the port, not in use, and unemployed dockers looking for work which was not there at that time. Then the National Socialists took over the power in Germany, and they had this autarky strategy, no trade, focus on the local or on the regional and the national economy. Only battleships were built in that period before World War II, just one or two of these passenger ships, and then there was a kind of a stagnation in the 1930s. You can see it here, the port area was not increased when you compare these two maps from 1925 and 1945. But the port in Hamburg was bombed heavily, and you can see this kind of destruction. What happened, about 40 or 50% of the port were destroyed, and even after World War II, the British and the American allies destroyed some of the cranes and some of the docks. So it was really a new start after World War II for the port. And here again you can see the ways of cargo handling. Yeah, some more modern strategies, but of course further casual labor, dangerous labor when the crane is not functioning or whatever could happen. But most important, after World War II, was that Germany, and especially the port of Hamburg, lost its hinterland, Eastern Europe. You can see there was a big divide here afterwards, and all these countries and cities here were delivered by the port of Hamburg. And these areas, these countries, these cities were lost as a hinterland. So the question was, what strategy can be developed to get a growth strategy again? Well, here you can see the port in 1980 and in 2000, and you can see there is a further development into the western direction, away from the city center. Here is a redevelopment project of Hafen City located, but the new option was now to focus on other regions. The hinterland in Eastern Europe was lost, you can say, but yeah, other ways were developed. So for example, trade with Southern America, bananas, oranges, and other goods. And Hamburg had always this slogan, being a quick port. So when the goods came in, they were unloaded very quickly so that the ships could leave the port. Again, new ways of cargo handling at that time. But then there was another catastrophe. We talked about flooding this morning. Already in 1962, there was a flood catastrophe here in Hamburg, and all these areas, the port area more or less, was flooded. So you can imagine it was a big disaster. About 300 people died, and afterwards, well, higher dikes were built to protect the port and the shipyards after this catastrophe. And then for shipbuilding, there was also another diversification. There was a short boom of building tankers. So, for example, the large tanker at that time, Tina Onassis, was built in Hamburg. At that time, that was possible. This is the man who was married with the wife of John Kennedy later. So at that time, oil was very important, good, shipbuilding also, but this was also already the starting point for the crisis in shipbuilding, because it was cheaper to build ships in China or South Korea, and then many jobs were lost in the shipbuilding field, and also new strategies began. For example, container handling and the container revolution, you can see with these type of cranes, was started already here in the 1970s, but we'll hear more about it later. But for the docker, it was still necessary to have a kind of a dock pass to get into the port, and still many goods were unloaded here by hand until that time. So just one figure, you can see the trade here in million tons, an increase from 1868 until 2000. You can see the percentage of containers in 1967, just 1%. Meanwhile, well, 93 or even more percent. The jobs which were lost, 25,000 in 1986, more or less 5,000 now, and in shipbuilding, it's in a way similar. But on the other hand, of course, there were new jobs founded in logistics and other businesses relating to the port. So these figures are a bit misleading. The port is still an important engine for the local economy in Hamburg, but Hamburg had one advantage on one hand and one disadvantage on the other hand. So it's located about 100 kilometers away from the Northern Sea, from the Atlantic, and all ships have to go this long way. So when the river is not deep enough, you can see here the increase of the ships getting bigger and bigger, and then of course there was dredging necessary, and you can see here how it goes. and in a way that's expensive, dredging the river, and of course it's also a bit ecological problematic, but necessary to be an important hub for cargo handling also in the future. But talking about seaports and the economic importance, I think the ports are much more than only cargo handling and shipbuilding. So they are important, and they have a very special maritime culture, special seaport culture, and maybe this illustrates it. So we have all these kind of movies, novels, and so on dealing with this port. And I think this is really unique, not only the economy, but also the culture of seaport cities. And many movies were made in Hamburg here, for example. So the maritime culture, of course, is on one hand tangible when you talk about warehouses, the infrastructure, and so on. But on the other hand, it's intangible. And when you look at these CDs here or records, it was always an important image for the seaport and for the image of the city. So you cannot imagine Hamburg without a port. So seaports and waterfronts especially are places where the local and the exotic, the foreign and the familiar, poverty and riches, tradition and modernization meet. So in a way, one can say that they are culminations of innovations in economy, society and culture, command centers, yes, and forerunners of globalization. And this is illustrated perfectly by this image. A sea-going vessel here, and then the famous Chile House, a brick building from the 1920s. So these two pictures, these two images together, that's in a way the traditional image of Hamburg. Thank you for your attention. Questions and comments, and first we'll have a short translation. It will be easier for questions.
Oh, okay. Si tienen algunas preguntas, if they have some questions, I will receive from them or translate to you. Okay. Please, por favor, si tienen algunas preguntas, yo le hago la traducción al profesor. Sí. Or if you wanna ask in English, feel free. Welcome.
Buenas.
Buenas tardes.
Yo tengo una pregunta. Viendo pues que este puerto ha tenido un gran crecimiento, ¿qué considera usted que es como el punto fuerte o en el cual digamos, el punto en el cual uno puede, digamos, usar o aprovechar para poder pues moverlos? Otra vez, lo voy a poner otra vez. Quisiera saber cuál cree que es el punto fuerte en el cual se deba invertir el dinero para poder darle a un puerto este desarrollo que tiene.
Okay.
Lo digo pues con el objetivo de aprender de este para poder, pues se podría implementar en el puerto de aquí para darle el mismo desarrollo.
Okay. Based on the Hamburg experience, what do you think is the best strategic model or recommendation in order to do it over here in Barranquilla?
Okay. Well, I got a map this morning from Barranquilla, and the Rio Magdalena is not on this map. simply not on that map. So that's not good first for your orientation, but secondly, the river is essential for the history of Barranquilla. And I remember the novels from Marquez, for example. They dealt with the port situation, with the neighborhood next to the port, with the health condition and so on and so on. And I think this history is lost, more or less. There is one or two buildings existing which relates to the history of the port of Barranquilla, but now the port area is separated from the city. And I think it must be reconnected, and history and the port history and the culture of this port, these are very, very important elements which should be included in the waterfront revitalization and the transformation of the waterfront.
Okay. Él dice que la desconexión que existe con el río Magdalena, pues es una falla, hay que volver a construirla, y también la desconexión que existe entre la ciudad y la actividad portuaria. También señala que el mismo García Márquez hay unos lazos culturales muy importantes entre pues varias novelas de él son escenarios fluviales, por decir algo, ¿no? Y eso es lo que él señala, volver a recuperar la actividad económica y la actividad logística de lo que es tener un río tan importante como el Magdalena, y también trabajar más de cerca. Something has started, but, working between the river, waterfront, and the city, but it's just in the very beginning, Esa es la respuesta. ¿Alguna otra?
¿Aló?
Sí.
Bueno, mi pregunta no es una pregunta. O sea, yo quiero que me explique puntualmente esa imagen, ¿hace cuánto tiempo es? Esa que tiene ahí. O sea, yo quiero saber de qué año es esa fotografía y que si tiene una fotografía actual donde yo pueda comparar el cambio, la morfología, la hidrodinámica que ha tenido el río del tiempo de donde fue tomada la foto a ahora.
She wants to know which year this photo was taken and if there is any new version of this photo nowadays.
Okay. Yes, there are many pictures taken later, and it's easy to identify the year when the picture was taken. It was taken before World War II, because the warehouse A, the modern warehouse A, which is located here, was not constructed at that time. So I would suggest it's in the beginning of the 1930s. And well, this area here, I mentioned the warehouse district, you can see it here, which is World Heritage meanwhile. And well, this was transformed here, this area, for residential uses meanwhile. And here again, there is a shopping center going to be developed. And for example, this is the location of our university also in this district. So meanwhile, it's transformed, because the problem is quite simple, because you cannot handle containers here. There's not enough space. And these type of finger piers, which were built in the 19th century, where the ships could be unloaded on both sides of this quay, with sheds in the middle here. You can see it very good with railway connections and so on and so on. But container handling simply is not possible. And container handling means, meanwhile, 90-95% of cargo handling.
Okay. Bueno, yo traduzco lo que pude captarle. La foto viene de antes de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Él lo indica porque la segunda fila no está construida, ¿verdad? Hoy en día eso es residencial en este momento, y en la tercera fila al final es Hafen City University, ¿correcto? Containers in this area cannot be, container operation cannot be done because of the small area, correct?
Yeah.
No hay un área suficiente para operación de contenedores. No sé si quiera más. Okay. Thank you, Professor Schubert.
Thank you.
21ª Cátedra Europa, el encuentro académico y cultural del Caribe colombiano y el mundo académico europeo. Europa se vive en el Caribe.